The lantern's flame flickered against the rough-hewn beams of the attic, casting long shadows that danced like wary spirits. Elias Dunhill wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, the air thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. It was late summer in 1868, and the Illinois heat clung to everything, even up here under the eaves of their modest farmhouse. At 42, Elias was a man of steady habits, broad-shouldered from years tilling the black soil, his face etched with lines from squinting at endless fields. He had come up here to fetch an old trunk for the harvest tools, but the floorboards creaked under his boots in a way that felt off, heavier than usual. He paused, boot hovering mid-step. Something scratched faintly against the far wall, like nails on dry earth. Elias straightened, his heart quickening just a touch. Not fear, not yet, but the unease of a farmer sensing a blight before it shows. "Martha?" he called down the ladder, his voice muffled by the sloped ceiling. No answer came from below, only the distant hum of cicadas through the gable window. He shook it off as mice, or perhaps the wind rattling loose shingles, and continued forward, the lantern swinging to illuminate stacks of forgotten crates and yellowed newspapers from the war years. Kneeling by the trunk, Elias pried the lid open with a grunt. Inside lay rusted scythe blades and coiled ropes, undisturbed since last fall. But as he reached in, his fingers brushed something smooth and unyielding beneath the ropes, cold, like river stones polished by years underwater. He pulled it free, holding it to the light. A bone. Human, by the look of it, a femur, long and stark white, with no trace of marrow or flesh. Elias's breath caught, the attic suddenly colder despite the stifling air. He turned it over, tracing the curve with a thumb, his mind racing to the old tales from his grandfather about unmarked graves in these prairies, swallowed by the land after Indian wars or cholera outbreaks. But this was their attic, their home since 52. How? The scratching returned, sharper now, from the shadowed corner where the roof met the floor. Elias rose slowly, lantern raised, his free hand instinctively gripping the bone like a club. The shadows there seemed thicker, pooling unnaturally, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape, small, hunched, eyes glinting like wet pebbles. He blinked, and it was gone, just cobwebs swaying in a draught he couldn't feel. "Damn fool notions," he muttered, shoving the bone into his pocket and grabbing the trunk's handle. Whatever it was, he'd tell Martha come morning. She'd laugh it off, her practical wit cutting through his worries like a kitchen knife. Descending the ladder, the house settled around him with familiar creaks, the parlor below lit by the soft glow of the hearth. Martha was there, mending a quilt by the fire, her dark hair pinned back, face calm as always. At 38, she was the anchor, cautious where Elias charged ahead, her eyes sharp for signs of trouble in their 3 children. "Find what you needed?" she asked without looking up, needle flashing. Elias replied, setting the trunk down with a thud. He hesitated, the weight in his pocket pressing against his thigh. The attic felt distant already, the strangeness fading like a half-remembered dream. But as he sat beside her, pouring coffee from the pot, a faint scratching echoed from above, faint, insistent, like fingers testing the boards. Martha's needle paused, her head tilting slightly. "Rats?" she ventured, voice even. Elias nodded, though his gut twisted. Likely. That night, as the family bedded down, the boys, Thomas and young Caleb, snoring in their shared room, little Eliza tucked in with her doll, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The scratching persisted, rhythmic now, burrowing deeper into the walls. By dawn, when the first light filtered through the curtains, Elias rose with a resolve born of the fields, face it head-on, before it spread. He didn't mention the bone to Martha yet, no sense alarming her without proof. But as he stepped outside to the dew-kissed yard, the attic window above seemed to watch him, its glass fogged with something like breath. Elias Dunhill wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his calloused hand, the lantern's flicker casting long shadows across the attic beams. The air up here hung thick, like the breath of something ancient and unwilling to stir. He'd climbed the ladder just after dawn, compelled by Martha's uneasy report from the night before. A faint scratching, she said, like claws on wood. Now, as the first light filtered through the cracked slats, he saw it. Not scratches, but bones. Small ones, bird-like, scattered across the floorboards as if dropped from a height. He knelt, picking one up between thumb and forefinger. It felt wrong. Too clean, too white against the dust of years. Downstairs, the house creaked under the weight of the morning. Martha moved through the kitchen with deliberate steps, her apron dusted with flour from the bread she kneaded to steady her nerves. Eliza, their eldest at 14, sat at the table, her dark hair pinned back, eyes fixed on the window where the Illinois prairie stretched flat and unyielding. Tommy, 10, and full of restless energy, bounced a whittled stick against his knee, but even he was quieter than usual, glancing toward the stairs every few seconds. Elias descended the ladder with a bone clutched in his pocket, his boots thudding on each rung. He didn't call out until his feet hit the solid floor of the hallway. "Martha," he said, voice low, as if speaking louder might summon whatever had left its calling card. She turned from the stove, her face paling when she saw his expression. "It's real," he murmured, pulling the bone free. It glinted in the dim light, a tiny rib, perhaps from a sparrow or a mouse, all over the attic floor, like they'd been picked clean and piled up. Eliza stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "Let me see." She took the bone without asking, turning it over in her palm. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she pressed her lips thin, the cautious set of her jaw reminding Elias of his own mother, practical, unyielding in the face of farm hardships. "Could be animals," she said finally, though her voice wavered. "Raccoons, maybe. Got in through a loose board." Tommy peered over her shoulder, his wit sharpening into defense. "Raccoons don't clean bones like that. Look, it's polished almost. Like teeth marks, but neat." He snatched it from her, holding it to the light. "Pa, we gotta check the barn too. If it's comin' from outside." Martha crossed her arms, her brave front cracking just enough to show the worry lines etching deeper around her eyes. "No one's going anywhere till we know more. Elias, you boarded up that attic window last fall. Nothing's getting in." But her gaze flicked upward, as if the ceiling might betray her. The house had stood on this plot for 3 generations, bought cheap after the fever took the previous owners. Whispers in town spoke of bad luck, but Elias had dismissed them as settler superstition. Now, with the bone still warm in his hand from his pocket, doubt gnawed at him. He nodded, setting the bone on the table like evidence in a trial. "We'll search the place top to bottom. Eliza, you and Tommy check the cellar. Martha, with me in the attic again, bring the broom." As they moved, the floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing the house's own unease. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the faint scent of earth turned over, as if the ground itself were exhaling secrets long buried. In the attic, Martha swept the bones into a pile, her movement sharp and efficient, but Elias noticed how she avoided touching them directly. They weren't just scattered. Some formed patterns, loose circles, like nests abandoned in haste. "This ain't natural," he said, crouching to examine one cluster. A larger bone, maybe from a rabbit, lay at the center, its ends frayed as if gnawed by something with too many teeth. The air grew colder here, despite the rising sun, and a draft whispered through the seams, carrying a faint, metallic tang. From below, Tommy's voice called up, muffled but urgent. "Pa." "Cellar's got him, 2 little ones, piled by the jars." Elias exchanged a look with Martha, her hand tightening on the broom handle. The challenge had breached their sanctuary, seeping in like fog from the fields. Whatever it wasn't content with the heights anymore. Elias Dunhill wiped the sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the attic beams. The air up here hung thick, like breathing through wet wool, and every creak of the floorboards under his boots echoed too loudly in the confined space. He'd come up alone this time, after the whispers from downstairs had grown too insistent, Martha's voice, sharp with that edge she got when fear masqueraded as anger. It's nothing but mice, Elias. Or the wind settling the house. But he knew better. The scratches last night hadn't come from rodents. The trapdoor groaned as he pushed it wider, letting in a sliver of moonlight from the hallway below. His sons, young Thomas and the quieter Caleb, waited at the base of the ladder, their faces pale smudges in the dimness. Thomas clutched the axe handle like a talisman, while Caleb's fingers twisted the hem of his nightshirt. Elias had shooed them down earlier, but now regret not at him. The family was all they had in this sprawling Illinois farmhouse, miles from the nearest neighbor, and splitting up felt like tempting whatever lurked in the eaves. He stepped forward, boots thudding softly on the warped planks. The attic smelled of dust and something sharper, decay, faint but unmistakable, like meat left too long in the summer heat. His lantern swung low, illuminating crates stamped with faded labels from Chicago merchants, forgotten trunks from his father's time. And there, in the far corner where the roof sloped sharpest, the anomaly, a pile of bones, small and brittle, scattered like kindling. Not animal, not quite. Too curved in places, too human in their fragile elongation. They hadn't been there yesterday. Elias knelt, heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He reached out, then pulled back, the lantern trembling in his grip. One bone, no longer than his thumb, glinted with an unnatural sheen, as if coated in frost despite the humid night. A whisper slithered through the air, not from the wind but from the walls themselves, soft, insistent, like dry leaves rustling over gravel. "Join us." Downstairs, Martha's voice cut through the floorboards, muffled but urgent. "Elias? The boys say they heard it again. Up there with you." He straightened, ignoring the chill that prickled his neck, and called back, "Stay put. It's just old junk shifting." But his voice cracked on the lie, and he knew she heard it. As he gathered a few bones into his handkerchief, careful, so careful not to touch them skin to bone, a floorboard shifted beneath him, loose and eager, as if the house itself were stirring awake. Oarboard sighed behind him. He spun, lantern arcing light across empty space. Nothing. Yet the shadows seemed thicker now, pooling in the corners like ink. Thomas's shout echoed up. "Pa?" Something scratching at the window. Elias froze. The attic had no windows, not on this side of the house. He backed toward the trapdoor, bones clutched tight, the whispers multiplying into a chorus that clawed at his ears. Whatever had filled their attic overnight wasn't content with silence anymore. It wanted company, and as he descended the ladder, the pile in the corner stirred, just slightly, rearranging itself into the vague shape of a hand reaching out. Elias Dunhill wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the attic air thick and stale, like the breath of something long buried. The lantern's flame flickered against the rafters, casting jagged shadows that danced over the piles of bones they'd managed to drag down from the eaves. Human, animal, didn't matter much now. They all looked the same in the dim light, bleached white and unnaturally clean, as if scrubbed by invisible hands. His wife, Clara, knelt beside him, her skirts bunched up to avoid the dust, sorting through the remnants with trembling fingers. Their son, young Thomas, hovered at the ladder, his 11-year-old face pale but set with that stubborn determination Elias had always admired. "We can't just leave them here," Clara whispered, her voice barely cutting through the quiet. She held up a slender rib, turning it in the light. "What if they come back?" Elias didn't answer right away. He'd spent the morning hammering boards over the attic hatch, convinced that sealing it would end the madness. But as the sun climbed high, a faint scratching had started again, like nails on wood from above the new barrier. By afternoon, when he'd pried it open with a crowbar, more bones had appeared, not scattered, but stacked neatly in the corner, as if someone had been busy while they slept. Or while they worked below, oblivious. Thomas edged closer, clutching the broom like a weapon. "Pa, I heard it last night. Not scratching. Whispers. Like wind through a keyhole, but words." Elias shot him a look, sharp enough to silence the boy, but Clara's hand flew to her mouth. You didn't tell us that. The boy shrugged, eyes fixed on the floor. Didn't want to scare Mom more. Elias set the lantern down and stood, his boots crunching on brittle fragments. The house felt heavier today, the walls pressing in with the weight of unseen eyes. They burned a small pile in the yard that morning, the smoke acrid and black, rising like a signal to whatever force had chosen their farm. But the attic refilled, mocking their efforts. He glanced at the boarded hatch, solid oak, nailed tight. No way anything could slip through. A low groan echoed from above, not from the roof, but deeper, as if the bones themselves were settling into place. Clara gasped, dropping the rib. It clattered against a femur, the sound sharp and final. Thomas froze, broom raised halfway. Stay here, Elias muttered, grabbing the lantern. He climbed the ladder slowly, each rung creaking under his weight, the light swinging wild shadows across the underside of the boards. His heart pounded, steady but insistent, like the tick of the parlor clock downstairs. At the top, he pressed his ear to the wood. Silence, thick and waiting. Then a soft tap. Once. Twice. Like knuckles on a door. He hammered the boards harder that evening, driving nails until his arms ached, Clara and Thomas hauling more bones down to the fire pit outside. The sky had turned bruised purple, the Illinois fields whispering in the wind, but the farm felt isolated, cut off from the neighbors a mile down the road. No one had come calling since the preacher's visit 2 days back, when he blessed the house and left with a furrowed brow, muttering about old graves disturbed. By dusk, the attic was empty again, or as empty as they could make it. Elias barred the hatch with a heavy beam from the barn, swearing it would hold. Clara prepared a meager supper of cornbread and beans, her eyes distant, hands moving on autopilot. Thomas ate in silence, pushing food around his plate, until he finally blurted, "What if it's the land?" Pa, remember Grandpa's stories about the mound by the creek? Said it was cursed, bones of the old ones. Clara's fork clattered. Hush that. Your grandfather was a storyteller, not a prophet. But Elias felt the chill settle in his bones, not from the draft, but from the memory. The creek ran swollen this spring, after the rains unearthed arrowheads and shards in the yard. He'd thought nothing of it then, relics from some forgotten tribe. Now, as night fell, the house groaned with the wind, and he wondered if the whispers Thomas heard were echoes from that mound, rising unbidden. Sleep came fitful, the family huddled in the parlor with a single lamp burning low. Elias dozed in his chair, rifle across his lap, while Clara stitched a quilt by the fire, her needle flashing like a warning. Thomas curled on the rug, breath even but shallow. It started near midnight, a faint rustle from above, like dry leaves shifting. Elias bolted upright, the rifle cold in his grip. Clara's eyes met his, wide with the same dread. The rustle grew, deliberate now, bones clicking together in rhythm, building to a cascade that shook the ceiling dust down in fine powder. Thomas whimpered, sitting up. It's them. They're moving. Elias rose, aiming the lantern's beam at the ceiling. The beam across the hatch held firm, but the sounds didn't stop. They circled, paced, as if whatever animated them was testing the boundaries, learning the shape of their prison. Clara clutched Thomas close. We can't stay here. Tomorrow we go to town. Tell the sheriff, get help. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The sheriff was a practical man, not one for ghost tales. But as the clicking softened to murmurs, indistinct words weaving through the cracks, he knew silence wouldn't serve them anymore. The bones weren't just filling the attic, they were filling the house, seeping into the walls, the floors, waiting for a way down. Dawn broke gray and reluctant. Elias gripped the attic ladder with knuckles white as bone, the wood creaking under his weight like a warning. Below, in the dim flicker of the lantern Clara held, Thomas paced the hallway, his usual quips silenced by the chill that seeped through the floorboards. It had been 3 nights since the first rattle, subtle at first, like pebbles shifting in a boot, but now the sounds carried weight, a dry scraping that echoed through the rafters as if something inside was settling into place. He climbed slowly, each rung a deliberate press against the fear gnawing his gut. The air grew thicker up here, laced with dust and something sharper, like old earth turned over. At the top, the ladder deposited him into the familiar clutter, trunks shoved against the eaves, forgotten crates from the move from Boston. But the shadows tonight stretched wrong, pooling in corners where they shouldn't. Pa! Thomas's voice floated up, edged with that boyish bravado he clung to like a shield. You see anything? Or is it just more of Ma's winter linens come alive? He lifted the lantern, its flame dancing across the beams. There, against the far wall, where the roof sloped low, a pile. Not crates, not cloth. Bones. Small ones, like those of birds or rodents, scattered as if spilled from a sack, but arranged too neatly, fanning out in a half-circle. His breath caught, fogging the glass. How had they gotten here? The attic door had been latched, the windows sealed against the Illinois wind. A soft clatter pulled his gaze to the center of the room. Another bone, longer this time, a femur, perhaps from a fox, tumbled from nowhere, rolling to a stop at his boot. Elias froze, heart thudding against his ribs. The scraping resumed, faint but insistent, from the darkness beyond the light's reach. Downstairs, Clara set the lantern on the hall table and turned to Eliza, who huddled on the stairs, her small hands twisting the hem of her nightgown. It's nothing we can't handle, love, Clara said, though her voice wavered just enough to betray her. She'd always been the steady one, the one who patched roofs and birthed children without a midwife's help, but this house whispered secrets that no Illinois farm could explain. The bones had started in the corners 2 nights ago, then multiplied by morning, as if the attic breathed them in from the night sky. Eliza's eyes, wide and shadowed, fixed on the ladder. What if it's the devil's work, Ma? Like the preacher said about the unmarked graves out by the river? Clara knelt, pulling her close. Preachers talk to fill pews. Your pa's up there now, seeing for himself. But even as she spoke, a shiver ran through her, the same one that had woken her at midnight, when the air in their bedroom turned cold and the faint odor of decay lingered, gone by dawn. Elias edged forward, lantern raised high. The pile grew as he approached, vertebrae and ribs mingling with shards of something finer, like fish spines. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched one. It was dry, brittle, real. No blood, no flesh, just the hollow architecture of death. But as his hand withdrew, the scraping intensified, a chorus now, from multiple points, as if the bones were calling to kin. He backed away, boot nudging another piece. It skittered across the floorboards, and in its wake, though it seemed to groan, a hairline crack appearing where none had been. The house was shifting, accommodating whatever this was. Elias's mind raced. The realtor's vague warnings about the land's history, the way the attic felt too vast for the house's frame. He had to get down, tell the others, but the latter suddenly felt miles away. Thomas, he called, voice rough. Come up here. Bring the axe from the shed. The boy's footsteps pounded up the rungs, his face paling as he crested the edge. God Almighty, he whispered, eyes on the pile. It's like a graveyard up here. What do we do, Pa? Burn it. Elias shook his head, the lantern swinging shadows across the walls. We figure out where it's coming from first. But deep down, he knew burning wouldn't stop it. The bones weren't invading. They were being invited, piece by piece, into the heart of their home. From below, Clara's voice rose, urgent. Elias? What's happening? Eliza whimpered, and the sound twisted something in him. They couldn't leave, not with winter closing in and no other roof in miles. But staying meant facing whatever filled their attic, night after unrelenting night. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering against the rough-hewn beams of the attic ladder. The air up here hung thick, like breath held too long, and the scent of damp earth clung to everything. Below, in the dim kitchen, Martha's voice carried up sharp and urgent. Hurry, Elias. The boy's fever's breaking, but those things are stirring again. He didn't need reminding. The bones had multiplied since dawn, skittering like dry leaves in a windless room whenever the family turned away. Thomas lay on the pallet they'd dragged into the parlor, his face slick with sweat, chest rising in shallow pulls. The 16-year-old had been the first to climb up 2 nights past, poking at what they thought was a raccoon's nest gone wrong. Now his arm bore the mark, a lattice of fine scratches that wept clear fluid, not blood. Eliza hovered at his side, her cautious hands wringing a cloth, eyes darting to the ceiling as if expecting it to crack open. "Pa, you think it's the fever talking, or?" She trailed off, but Elias knew. The boy had mumbled about whispers in the walls, voices piecing together stories from the bones. He ascended the ladder with deliberate steps, boots thudding on each rung to announce himself. No surprises this time. The attic floorboards creaked under his weight, and there they were, the bones. Piles of them. Rabbit skulls nestled against deer ribs, fragments of something larger. Human? No, couldn't be, scattered like forgotten kindling. But they weren't still. As the lantern light swept across, a faint rattle echoed, as if fingers tapped from within the wood. Elias knelt by the largest heap, near the gable window where frost etched patterns like veins. He'd come prepared, a burlap sack from the barn, doused in kerosene from the shed. "Out with you," he muttered, scooping the first armful. The bones clattered into the sack, cold and unnaturally smooth, as if polished by years underwater. One piece, a long femur, too slender for any beast he knew, slipped from his grasp and rolled toward the shadows. He lunged for it, fingers brushing something soft beneath the floor. A loose board? His heart quickened. The Dunhills had lived on this land since his father claimed it from the prairie, but stories from the old settlers spoke of barrows, ancient mounds buried under the sod. Had they built atop one? Downstairs, a crash jolted him upright. Eliza's cry pierced the quiet. "Pa, it's moving," the pile by the stairs. He bolted down, sack forgotten, lantern swinging wild. In the hallway, bones spilled from a seam in the wall, tumbling like an avalanche in slow motion. They formed shapes as they fell, arching spines, hollow sockets staring up. Thomas stirred on his pallet, eyes glassy but open. "They're calling names," he rasped. "Our names, Pa. Yours first." Martha burst from the kitchen, shotgun in hand, her face pale but set. She'd always been the steady one, mending fences while Elias tilled the stubborn soil. Now she leveled the barrel at the heap. "We end this tonight. Burn the house if we must." But as she spoke, the bones shifted, assembling into a crude tower that leaned toward the boy. Elias grabbed a poker from the hearth, jabbing at it. The structure toppled, but not before a single vertebra lodged in Thomas's sleeve, drawing a thin line of blood. They worked in frantic silence after that, sweeping the fragments into the hearth and setting them ablaze. Flames licked up eagerly, popping and hissing, as if the bones protested. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, carrying with it a faint, acrid whisper, indistinct but insistent. Eliza pressed close to her mother, whispering, "What if fire ain't enough? What if it's in the ground?" Elias watched the fire die down to embers, the ashes inert at last. For a moment, peace settled, broken only by the wind rattling the shutters. But as midnight tolled from the distant church bell, a new sound rose from the attic, not a rattle, but a low groan, like roots straining against stone. The floorboards above vibrated, and dust sifted down like snow. Thomas bolted upright, fever gone, eyes wide with something sharper than fear. "It's waking," he said, voice steady for the first time in days. "And it knows we've tried to fight." Elias exchanged a glance with Martha. The bones were gone, but the house felt heavier, as if the land beneath had taken a breath and held it, waiting. Elias Dunhill wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting jagged shadows across the attic beams. The air hung thick with dust and something sharper, like old meat left too long in the sun. He'd come up here alone after supper, against Mary's stern warning, because the scratching had started again, faint at first, like nails on wood, then deeper, rhythmic, as if whatever lurked below the eaves was testing the floorboards. The family had boarded up the lower levels as best they could, but the bones kept appearing, piled in corners like forgotten kindling, small ones that might have been bird or beast, and larger, too human-shaped to ignore. He knelt by the newest heap, near the chimney stack, prodding it with a poker from downstairs. A femur, cracked and yellowed, rolled free, its marrow hollowed out. Elias's stomach twisted. He'd seen enough slaughter on the farm to know this wasn't from any cow or hog. The scratching paused, then resumed from the far wall, behind the crates of moth-eaten quilts his mother had stored decades ago. He rose slowly, heart thudding against his ribs, and edged toward the sound, the lantern held high. The crates shifted as he approached, not with a crash but a subtle groan, wood protesting under unseen weight. He wedged the poker into a gap and pried, revealing a dark slit where the wall met the roofline. The scratching intensified, coming from inside the wall itself, vibrating through the plaster like a swarm burrowing deeper. Elias leaned in, the lantern's glow piercing the gloom, and caught a glint, white, curved, pushing through a fissure. Another bone, rib-like, forcing its way out as if the house were exhaling secrets. Downstairs, the clock struck 10, its chime muffled through the floor. Elias froze. Mary would be pacing the kitchen, little Theo clutched to her side, while Clara pretended to read by the fire, her sharp eyes darting to every creak. They'd agreed no more solo ventures after the last time, when he'd returned with scratches on his arms that burned like acid. But waiting wasn't an option. The piles grew nightly, and last dawn they'd found one in Theo's room, right under his bed, small enough to be a child's finger. He swung the lantern closer, and the bones snapped free, clattering to the floor. Behind it, the wall bulged, plaster dust sifting down like fine snow. A low rasp echoed from the cavity, not scratching now but breathing, wet, labored, as if lungs filled with gravel expanded and collapsed. Elias backed away, poker raised, but his boot caught on a loose board, and he stumbled, the lantern swinging wildly. Light danced across the wall, illuminating a seam he'd never noticed before, running vertically from beam to rafter, lined with what looked like teeth marks, deep gouges as if something had clawed its way in from the outside. The breathing quickened, sinking with his own ragged breaths. He turned to flee, but the attic door, left ajar, slammed shut with a force that rattled the hinges. No wind-up here, no draft from the sealed windows. Elias lunged for it, yanking the knob, but it held fast, the wood splintering under his grip. Panic clawed at his throat. "Mary," he shouted, voice cracking, but the sound barely carried, swallowed by the thickening air. From the wall, a hand emerged, not flesh, but bone, articulated and gleaming, fingers splaying like a spider's legs. It grasped the edge of the fissure, pulling more of itself free. A wrist, an ulna, piecing together with faint clicks. Elias hammered at the door, shoulder slamming wood, but the thing in the wall kept coming, methodical, unhurried. The breathing grew louder, joined by whispers, indistinct at first, then clearer, murmuring names. His name, Elias. He whirled, poker thrusting forward, but the skeleton arm deflected it effortlessly, bones clattering against metal. It reached for him, cold phalanges brushing his sleeve, and in that touch, a chill seeped into his veins, visions flashing unbidden. The farm at dusk, shadows lengthening into shapes that weren't human, attics across the county sagging under invisible loads. The Dunhills weren't the first. They were just the latest, drawn by the soil's old hunger, the Illinois earth that swallowed pioneers whole and spat back their remnants. The door shuddered, then burst open, Mary, wild-eyed, wielding the axe from the woodpile. She swung without a word, blade biting into the bony arm, severing it at the elbow. Shards scattered like brittle porcelain, and the breathing hitched, fading to a hiss. Elias scrambled past her, down the ladder, pulling her with him. They barred the attic hatch, breaths coming in gasps, but as they descended, the scratching resumed, not from above, but from below, rising through the floorboards like roots seeking light. In the parlor, Theo whimpered from his corner, bones clutched in his small fists like toys, while Clara stared at the ceiling, her face pale but resolute. "It's in the walls now," she said quietly, no fear in her voice, only the weary certainty of someone who'd pieced together the pattern. "All of them." Elias nodded, the severed hand's chill lingering in his bones. They'd burn the house tomorrow, salt the earth, flee west, but deep down, he knew the attics would follow, empty no matter where they ran. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a heartbeat in the dim crawlspace beneath the house. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, decay, perhaps, or the metallic tang of old blood. He'd insisted on coming alone this time, away from the women's watchful eyes upstairs, but now, as his fingers brushed the rough-hewn beams supporting the floorboards, doubt gnawed at him. The scratching had started again last night, faint at first, like nails on wood, then building to a frantic rhythm that echoed through the attic slats. It wasn't rats. He knew that now. He wedged the lantern into a crevice and pulled the small shovel from his belt, the one he'd used for planting potatoes just weeks ago. The ground here was packed hard, undisturbed for years, but Elias dug anyway, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Clods of soil tumbled away, revealing nothing but worms writhing in the lamplight. Then his shovel struck something solid, not wood, not stone. A dull thud reverberated up his arms. He scraped around it, heart pounding, until a pale curve emerged, a rib, human-sized, cracked and yellowed with age. "God help us," he muttered, dropping to his knees. The bone wasn't alone. As he cleared more dirt, a cluster appeared, vertebrae, a femur, all jumbled like forgotten kindling. They weren't from the attic. These were buried, hidden beneath the foundation of their home. Elias's mind reeled. The Dunhills had built this place 20 years back, on land his father swore was clean, far from the old Indian mounds the neighbors whispered about. But bones didn't just appear. Not like this. Upstairs, the house creaked as if settling under an invisible weight. He thought of Clara, his wife, barricading the attic door with the heavy oak chest, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. And little Thomas, their boy of 10, who hadn't spoken since he'd found the first skull wedged in the rafters 2 days past, a child's skull, small and fragile, with empty sockets staring like accusations. Elias had burned it in the yard, but the smoke had hung low, refusing to rise, and that night the scratching began. He gathered the bones carefully, wrapping them in his handkerchief, but as he did, a whisper slithered through the crawlspace, not wind, but words, too faint to catch. Elias froze, shovel raised. The lantern sputtered, casting shadows that danced like fingers reaching from the walls. He backed away, scrambling toward the ladder, the bundle clutched to his chest. Whatever this was, it was in the bones. In the house. In them. Climbing out, he emerged into the kitchen, where the afternoon light slanted through the windows like bars. Clara was at the table, mending a tear in Thomas's shirt, her needle moving in steady, deliberate strokes. She looked up, eyes widening at the dirt smeared across his face. "Elias? What did you find?" He set the bundle down, unfolding it with trembling hands. The bones spilled out, stark against the worn pine. Clara's needle clattered to the floor. "Buried under us," he said, voice rough. "All this time." Thomas peered from the doorway, his face half hidden in shadow, eyes wide but silent. The boy had always been quiet, watchful, but now it was as if the words had been stolen from him, replaced by a fear that mirrored Elias's own. "We can't stay," Clara whispered, reaching for the bones as if to touch them, then pulling back. "It's spreading. Last night, I heard it in the walls, not just the attic. The whole house breathes." Elias nodded, glancing toward the stairs. The plan had been to flee at dawn, pack the wagon and head for the river town, but the horses had gone lame overnight, their stalls filled with brittle twigs that snapped like bones underfoot. "No coincidence. We'll go on foot if we must. But first we burn these. All of them." As they carried the bundle to the hearth, the scratching resumed, fainter now, but closer, as if pursuing them from the depths. Elias struck the match, watching the flames lick at the bones, but they smoldered stubbornly, releasing a acrid smoke that curled toward the ceiling. In the haze, he swore he saw shapes, outlines of limbs, torsos, faces pressing against the rafters above. The house groaned in response, a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the floor. Thomas tugged at his sleeve, finally breaking his silence with a whisper. "Pa, they're waking up." Elias pulled the boy close, the fire's heat warring with the growing cold in his bones. Outside, the Illinois wind howled, rattling the shutters, but inside, the true storm was just beginning. They had to move tonight, before the attics claimed more than bones. The air up here hung thick, like breathing through wet cloth, and every creak from the house below set his teeth on edge. He'd come alone this time, leaving Mary and the boys in the parlor with the doors barred, their whispers chasing him up the stairs like ghosts. The bones were back, piled higher now, spilling from crates that hadn't held so much as a moth-eaten quilt yesterday. He knelt by the largest mound, fingers trembling as he sifted through the fragments, ribs curved like scythes, skulls staring empty from the heap, all too clean, too white, as if polished by hands unseen. A low rumble echoed from the rafters, not thunder, but something deeper, burrowing into the wood. Elias froze, heart pounding against his ribs. He told himself it was rats, or wind rattling the eaves, but the piles grew overnight, filling spaces no vermin could reach. Last night, he'd burned a dozen armfuls in the yard, the flames hissing as if the bones fought the fire. Yet here they were again, mocking his efforts. He grabbed a femur, heavy and cold, and smashed it against the floorboards. It splintered with a crack that split the silence, shards scattering like teeth from a broken jaw. Downstairs, a door slammed. Elias bolted upright, lanterns swinging wild. "Mary?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the attic's maw. No answer, just the slow groan of floorboards underfoot. He edged toward the ladder, bones crunching beneath his boots, each step a betrayal of the house he'd built with his own calloused hands. The family had whispered of curses since the first discovery. Old Indian burial grounds, they said, disturbed when the town expanded. But Elias knew better. This was no ancient grudge. It felt personal, like the land itself was exhaling its dead into their home. He descended halfway, peering into the dim hallway below. The boys, Thomas and little Samuel, huddled by the fireplace, their faces pale smudges in the gloom. Mary stood at the kitchen threshold, her apron clutched tight, eyes fixed on the back door. "Elias," she hissed. "It's out there again, scratching at the windows." He dropped the last few rungs, boots thudding soft on the landing. The scratching wasn't new, started a week ago, faint at first like nails on glass. Now it clawed deeper, rhythmic, insistent. Elias crossed to the window, peering through the lace curtains. Moonlight silvered the yard, the oak tree's branches swaying lazy, but beyond the fence, shapes moved in the cornfield. Not animals. Silhouettes too tall, too still, hunched as if listening. "Get the rifles," he said, voice steady for their sakes. Thomas, brave at 12, fetched them from the cabinet, his hands shaking as he passed one to his father. Samuel whimpered, burying his face in Mary's skirts. Elias loaded the chamber, the click loud in the quiet house. "Stay inside. Barricade if I say." Mary's grip tightened on his arm. "You're not going out there alone. I have to see what it is." He pulled free, the weight of the rifle a cold comfort. The scratching grew frantic, glass vibrating under invisible force. He unlatched the door, stepping onto the porch. The night air bit sharp, carrying the scent of turned earth and decay. The cornstalks rustled, parting like a curtain, and there, emerging from the rows, a figure, skeletal thin, draped in rags that fluttered like moth wings. Its head tilted, sockets dark voids, and from its chest protruded a ribcage that gleamed unnaturally, as if the bones were its skin. Elias raised the rifle, finger hovering on the trigger. The thing didn't advance, just stood, arms dangling loose, fingers tipped with what looked like splintered bone. A wind sighed through the field, and it mimicked the sound, a hollow whistle from its lipless mouth. He fired. The shot cracked the night, the figure jerking back, but no blood sprayed, no collapse. Instead, it dissolved into shadow, unraveling like smoke, leaving only a scatter of white fragments on the soil. Panting, Elias lowered the gun, staring at the remnants. More bones. Always more. From the attic, a faint clatter echoed, as if the piles were shifting, spreading. He turned back to the house, the door creaking open on its own. Inside, Mary's voice rose in a sob. Elias, the stairs, the banister. It's covered. He rushed in, lantern high. Coiling up the steps like vines, thin white tendrils snaked from the wood, brittle and branching, forming shapes that whispered of spines and femurs. The house was filling, from the ground up, the bones weaving into its very frame. Thomas grabbed a poker from the fire, jabbing at the growth, but it only crumbled into dust that swirled and reformed higher. Samuel screamed as a tendril brushed his ankle, cold as grave soil. We can't stay, Elias said, pulling them toward the front door. But as they moved, the floorboards buckled, cracks spidering out, and from the fissures, fingers bony, questing, pushed up, grasping at the air. The scratching was everywhere now, inside and out, the walls groaning as if birthing their own dead. Elias shoved the family ahead, rifle slung over his shoulder, but the door wouldn't budge. It was sealed, not with latch or lock, but with a lattice of ribs, interlocking like a cage. Mary beat her fists against it, tears streaking her face. What do Elias Dunhill gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a heartbeat against the attic's suffocating dark. The air up here had thickened since dawn, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like old iron. His boots scraped against the floorboards as he edged forward, the beam of light carving narrow paths through the shadows. Behind him, Clara whispered his name, her voice a threadbare plea, but he didn't turn. The bones were everywhere now, piled in corners, scattered like forgotten kindling, some still wrapped in scraps of cloth that might have been skin once. She caught up, her hand brushing his arm, cold and trembling. We can't stay. The children, quiet, he hissed, though he felt the same pull in his gut, the one that said running was futile. Downstairs, the house groaned as if alive, floorboards shifting under invisible weight. They'd barricaded the attic door hours ago, after the first screams from below faded into silence. Now, the only sounds were their breaths and the faint, rhythmic tapping from the rafters, like fingers drumming on wood. Clara's eyes darted to the gable window, where moonlight sliced through grimy panes. Outside, the Illinois fields stretched black and endless, the family's farm a solitary speck under the stars. No neighbors for miles, no one to hear if they called. She clutched the small bundle of heirlooms they'd salvaged, a locket from her mother, a rusted key Elias swore opened nothing anymore. What if it's in the walls? What if it followed us up? He didn't answer, couldn't. The tapping grew insistent, closer, as if whatever lurked mimicked their movements. Elias swung the lantern high, illuminating a fresh mound of bones near the chimney, vertebrae stacked like cordwood, gleaming white. They hadn't been there when they climbed up. His mind reeled back to the night it started, the attic door creaking open on its own, the faint rustle like dry leaves, and by morning, the piles appearing as if conjured from the ether. The town whispered of curses on old land, of settlers disturbing graves long buried under the prairie sod, but Elias had dismissed it until the family cat vanished, its collar found nestled in a skull. A low scrape echoed from the far end, deliberate, pulling him forward. Clara followed, her skirt catching on a nail, tearing with a sharp rip. They rounded a beam, and there it was, not a pile, but a shape. Bones arranged in a crude form, limbs splayed, a ribcage arched like a cage waiting to snap shut. At its center, a single eye socket stared empty, but Elias swore it watched them. Elias. Clara's cry was sharp, her foot kicking something that skittered away, a small bone, phalange thin, rolling to a stop at his toe. He knelt, heart pounding, and picked it up. It was warm, impossibly so, as if fresh from a body. The tapping intensified, now from all sides, a chorus building. Down below, a thud shook the floor, something heavy, testing the barricade. Elias dropped the bone, standing abruptly. We go out the window. Rope from the bales, now. She nodded, already moving, her caution giving way to the raw edge of survival. They uncoiled the hemp rope they'd stored for harvest, knotting it hastily to the sturdy beam. The lantern swung wild as Elias secured it, shadows leaping like specters across the walls. Clara tied the other end around her waist first, her hands steadier than his. The children, if they're gone, they're not, he lied, the words bitter. Little Thomas and Mary had been herded into the root cellar at dusk, doors bolted, but the tapping had started there too, faint echoes rising through the vents. As Clara swung her leg over the sill, the glass rattled, frost creeping across it unbidden. The night air rushed in, crisp and biting, carrying the distant howl of wind through the cornstalks. She rappelled down first, her form vanishing into the gloom below, a soft thump signaling her landing. Elias followed, the rope burning his palms, the attic's darkness nipping at his heels like breath. He hit the ground running, Clara already at the cellar door, prying at the lock with the rusted key. It turned with a groan, but inside, emptiness. No cries, no small forms huddled in the dark. Only more bones, strewn across the dirt floor, arranged in tiny outlines that mirrored the shapes of their children. Clara collapsed against him, a sob escaping, but Elias pulled her up, eyes scanning the treeline. The tapping followed, faint but persistent, as if the house itself laughed. They fled toward the wagon, the bones' secret chasing them into the night, the farm shrinking behind like a grave, waiting to yawn wider. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering against the damp walls of the root cellar. The air down here was thicker than upstairs, heavy with the scent of earth and something sharper, decay, perhaps, or the metallic tang of fear. He could hear the muffled thumps from above, like footsteps dragging across floorboards, but slower now, as if whatever haunted the house had grown weary of its hunt. Or was savoring the chase. "Pa, we can't stay here forever," whispered young Thomas, his voice barely cutting through the gloom. The boy huddled against the potato sacks, his face pale under the lantern's glow, eyes wide with that mix of defiance and terror that only a 12-year-old could muster. Elias had always admired his son's grit, the way he'd stood firm when the bones first appeared in the attic, clattering like dry leaves in a gale, but tonight, that bravery felt fragile, a thin veil over the panic bubbling beneath. "Hush now," Elias replied, his own voice low and steady, though his heart hammered like a blacksmith's anvil. He pressed a finger to his lips, straining to listen. The Dunhill farmhouse had been their sanctuary for generations, built by his grandfather on this stubborn Illinois soil, but in the span of one cursed night, it had twisted into a labyrinth of whispers and shadows. The bones, human, animal, ancient and fresh, had spilled from the attic vents like an unholy harvest, filling every corner with their brittle accusations. And now, with Mary and little Eliza trapped upstairs, the house seemed to breathe, walls creaking as if alive. A soft scrape echoed from the stairs leading up. Elias froze, the lantern swinging slightly in his hand, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters. Thomas clutched his father's sleeve, breath coming in shallow bursts. "It's coming," the boy murmured, his free hand fumbling for the rusted pitchfork they dragged down as a weapon. Elias nodded, positioning himself between Thomas and the door. He'd seen too much already, the way the bones had arranged themselves into crude shapes, hands reaching, mouths gaping, overnight, as if the attic had birthed a graveyard. His wife Mary, ever the practical one with her sharp tongue and unyielding faith, had tried to burn them at dawn, but the flames had sputtered and died, leaving only acrid smoke that choked the air. Eliza, their youngest at 6, had sobbed through it all, claiming she heard voices in the marrow. The scrape grew louder, deliberate. Elias raised the pitchfork, its tines glinting faintly. "If it's the devil's work, we'll send it back," he said, more to steel himself than to comfort the boy. But doubt gnawed at him. What if it wasn't the devil? What if it was something older, stirred by the land itself, the old Indian mounds they'd plowed under years ago, or the fevered dreams of settlers who'd vanished in these parts? The door at the top of the stairs rattled, not with force, but with a patient insistence, like knuckles rapping on wood. Dust sifted down, carrying the faint rattle of tiny bones. Thomas whimpered, but Elias squeezed his shoulder. Remember what your ma said, face it together, or it wins. Then a voice, Mary's, faint but clear, filtered through the cracks. Elias. The attic, it's moving. Get up here. The rattle intensified, bones shifting like a tide. Elias glanced at Thomas, saw the resolve harden in his son's eyes. No time for plans that failed before. They had to climb, confront whatever nightmare the house had swallowed whole. With a deep breath, Elias handed the lantern to Thomas and started up the stairs, pitchfork ready, the weight of the unseen pressing down like the Illinois clay itself. Elias Dunhill gripped the attic ladder with hands slick from sweat and something darker, the air thick with the metallic tang of old blood. The bones had stopped multiplying hours ago, or so it seemed. Piles of them now formed grotesque arches across the floorboards, interlocking like the ribs of some ancient beast unearthed from the prairie soil. His wife, Clara, stood beside him, her face pale but set, the lantern in her hand casting shadows that danced like specters on the walls. The children, young Thomas and little Eliza, huddled at the base of the stairs below, their whispers barely audible over the wind howling through the eaves. He'd burned the first bundle last night, the one that had appeared under the eaves with its faint, inexplicable warmth, thinking it a prank from the circuit riders passing through town. But the flames had only spread the curse, bones sprouting from the ashes like weeds after rain, filling the spaces where family trunks and forgotten linens once sat. Now, as dawn's gray light filtered through the cracked window, Elias realized the truth. These weren't animal remains, nor relics from some forgotten grave. They whispered when no one listened, faint murmurs of names long buried, his father's, his grandfather's, voices from the Dunhill line that had tilled this Illinois land since the Black Hawk War. Clara's hand trembled on his arm. "We can't stay up here forever," she said, her voice steady despite the fear etching lines around her eyes. She'd always been the practical one, mending fences and birthing calves without complaint, but this had tested even her resolve. Last night, when the bones had begun to shift, forming shapes that mimicked outstretched arms, she'd barricaded the attic door with an old hope chest, buying them time. Elias nodded, his throat tight. The plan they'd hatched in the dead of night felt like madness now. Descend, gather what remained of their lives from the lower floors, and flee to the neighbor's farm before the bones claimed the whole house. But the stairs creaked ominously as he tested the first rung, a faint grinding sound rising from below, as if the structure itself were awakening. Thomas called up from the darkness, his boy's voice cracking with urgency.
Pa?
"Is it safe?" "Not yet," Elias replied, forcing calm into his words. He could see the outline of the boy's face in the lantern's glow, wide-eyed and clutching Eliza's hand. The girl, barely 5, hadn't spoken since the bones first appeared, her silence a heavier weight than any scream. Clara descended first, her skirts brushing against brittle femurs that littered the steps like fallen branches. Elias followed, lantern raised high, heart pounding with each creak. The hallway below was a tomb of shadows, furniture askew from their frantic searches earlier. The parlor clock ticked relentlessly, its pendulum swinging like a scythe. They moved as one, a ragged unit bound by desperation. Clara scooped up the satchel of bread and salted meat from the kitchen table, while Elias hauled the rifle from above the mantel, useless against his foe, but a comfort nonetheless. Thomas tugged at Eliza's sleeve, leading her toward the front door, but the girl froze, pointing at the floorboards. There, amid the dust, a new bone had emerged, a slender phalange, curling like a hook toward the threshold. "Keep moving," Elias urged, stepping over it. But as his boot connected with the wood, a low rumble shook the house. dust sifting from the ceiling like fine snow. The bones in the attic above shifted in response, a cascade of clatters echoing down. Outside, the Illinois dawn broke cold and unforgiving, the fields stretching barren under a sky heavy with clouds. They burst through the door, the cold air slapping their faces, and ran toward the wagon Elias had readied in the night. The horses stamped nervously, sensing the unnatural tremor that now rippled through the ground. Clara bundled the children into the back, her hands quick and sure. "To the miller's place," she said, climbing up beside Elias as he snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching over gravel, leaving the house shrinking in the distance. But as they crested the first hill, Elias glanced back. The attic window gaped like an empty eye socket, and for a moment he swore he saw movement, pale shapes shifting within, reaching. The rumble faded behind them, but the weight in his chest did not. They arrived at the miller's by midday, the neighbors taking them in without question, though their eyes lingered on the dust of bone meal clinging to the family's clothes. Whispers would spread through town soon enough, tales of the Dunhill curse, but Elias kept silent, focusing on the simple acts, chopping wood, mending harnesses, watching his children play in the yard as if the world hadn't tilted. Nights brought dreams of attics vast as prairies, filled with the skeletons of kin, their hollow eyes accusing. Clara woke him once, her touch grounding him back to the narrow bed they shared in the loft. "It's over," she murmured, though her voice held doubt. Weeks passed, the Illinois winter settling in with its iron grip. The house stood empty, avoided by trappers and peddlers alike. Elias returned once, under cover of dusk, rifle in hand. The attic was as they'd left it, bones piled high, but inert now, like relics in a museum of forgotten sins. He poured lamp oil across the threshold and struck a match. Flames roared up, consuming the wood and bone in a pyre that lit the prairie for miles. The heat warped the air, carrying acrid smoke toward the stars. Driving away, the fire at his back, Elias felt the first true easing in his chest. The Dunhills would rebuild, somewhere far from Illinois soil.